Margaret Flynn had lived a quiet life for 43 years in the small town of Ridgemont, Montana, where mountains stretched endlessly toward the sky, and the nearest city was 3 hours away by car, and her days were filled with organizing books at the library, helping children find adventure stories, and occasionally breaking up whispered arguments over computer time. And she had never been one to seek attention, with her graying hair usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her wardrobe consisting mostly of practical jeans and flannel shirts suitable for the cold Montana winters, and to anyone who passed her on the street, Margaret looked like exactly what she was, which was an ordinary middle-aged woman living a quiet life. But Margaret had a secret that very few people knew about, and she had grown up on a ranch as the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter, and her father was a stern but fair man named William Flynn, who had taught all his children to shoot, from the time they could hold a rifle steady, because it was a necessity in ranch country, where predators threatened livestock and the nearest. Law enforcement was often too far away to matter, and Margaret had taken to shooting the way some children take to music or art, and there was something meditative about it. Something pure in the way her breath steadied and the way the world narrowed down to just her. The rifle and the target and her brothers had been good shots, but Margaret had been exceptional, and her father had noticed, though he rarely praised her for it because that was not his way, and by the time she was 16, Margaret could outshoot every man on the ranch, including her father. But then life had happened with college, marriage, a career, and eventually a quiet divorce that left her back in Ridgemont working at the library and living in a small house on the edge of town, and she still owned her rifles and still went out to the old family property to shoot when she needed to clear her head. But she never talked about it because shooting was her private escape, and nothing more. And that all changed on a crisp Saturday morning in October, when Margaret decided to visit the Ridgemont Long-Range Shooting Complex, and the facility had opened 2 years earlier, funded by a group of wealthy shooting enthusiasts who wanted to create a premier destination for precision rifle competition. And it boasted ranges from 100 yards all the way out to 1,500 yards, along with climate-controlled shooting, bays, and a well-stocked pro shop, and Margaret had driven past it countless times but had never stopped, because it seemed like the kind of place for serious shooters, competitors and professionals, and not for a small-town librarian who just liked to plink at targets on her family's old property. But something that morning had compelled her to pull into the parking lot. And maybe it was the perfect autumn weather, or maybe it was the way the sun glinted off the metal roof of the main building, or maybe deep down she missed the challenge of testing herself against something difficult, and she walked into the main office carrying her rifle case, feeling suddenly self-conscious, and the woman behind the counter was a young blonde named Katie Morrison, who greeted her with a friendly smile and asked if it was her first time there, and Margaret replied yes, and said she was hoping to use one of the ranges, and Katie asked what distance she was thinking, and Margaret hesitated before asking what was available at the longer ranges, and Katie's eyebrows rose slightly, but her smile never wavered as she mentioned they had slots open at the 1,000-yard range, and asked if Margaret had shot at that distance before, and Margaret said once or twice, which was technically true, though it had been years ago, and Katie processed her payment and handed her a range assignment card telling her she would be on Bay 7 and that the range officer today was Danny Patterson, who would get her set up, and Margaret thanked her and made her way toward the long-range facility, which was a separate building set back from the main complex. And as she walked, she noticed several men standing outside with their expensive rifles resting on bipods and their gear arranged with military precision, and they were dressed in tactical clothing covered with patches and logos from various firearms manufacturers, and she recognized the type immediately, as these were the serious competitors, the ones who traveled to matches across the country, the ones who spent thousands of dollars on rifles and optics and ammunition, and they were having an animated discussion about bullet ballistics and wind drift, with their voices carrying across the parking lot, and one of them was a tall man with a thick beard and a baseball cap that read, "Precision Matters," and his name was Craig Hoffman, and he was something of a local celebrity in the long-range shooting community, because he had won several regional competitions and was known for his custom-built rifles and his willingness to share his opinions about everything related to shooting. And Craig nudged his companion, who was a shorter man named Ben Tucker, and gestured toward Margaret, and Craig called out to her as she passed with his tone polite, but carrying an undercurrent of condescension, that Margaret recognized immediately, and he asked if she was looking for someone, and mentioned that the beginner ranges were in the other building, and Margaret stopped and turned to face him, saying she was here for Bay 7 at the 1,000-yard range, and Craig and Ben exchanged glances, and Craig's expression shifted to something between amusement and concern as he repeated her words about the 1,000-yard range, and said he didn't mean to be rude, but that was pretty advanced shooting, and asked if she had qualified at that distance before. And Margaret replied evenly that she had shot at distance, and Ben began to say something, but Craig cut him off and said they were about to start a practice session for an upcoming match, and the wind conditions were tricky that day, and it really was not a good environment for someone who was not experienced, and maybe she should start at the 300-yard range and work her way up, and that the range officer could help her. And Margaret felt the familiar flush of frustration rising in her chest, but she forced it down because she had dealt with men like this her entire life, men who assumed that because she was a woman, because she was older, because she looked ordinary, she must not know what she was doing. Margaret appreciated Craig's concern, but told him in a calm voice that she had a reservation for Bay 7, and that was where she intended to shoot, and Craig held up his hands in a placating gesture, saying he was just trying to help, and that Danny Patterson was the range officer today and he was a stickler for safety, and if she was not comfortable at that distance, he was going to shut her down anyway, and Craig said he was just trying to save her the embarrassment, and Margaret said she would take her chances and continued walking toward the entrance. And behind her she heard Ben mutter something to Craig, followed by low laughter. But she did not turn around because she had learned long ago that the best response to condescension was competence, and inside the facility, Margaret found Bay 7 and began setting up her equipment, and her rifle was nothing fancy. Just a Remington 700 and .308 caliber that had belonged to her father, and she had upgraded the stock and the trigger over the years, but it was still a relatively modest setup compared to the high-end custom rifles she had seen outside. And as she was arranging her shooting mat and setting up her spotting scope, a shadow fell across her position, and she looked up to see a man in his 50s, wearing a range officer vest, and his name tag read Danny Patterson, and he asked if this was her first time shooting at 1,000 yards with his tone professional, but carrying the same hint of skepticism she had heard from Craig, and Margaret repeated that she had shot at distance before. And Danny nodded slowly and said the conditions today were pretty challenging, with a 15-mile-per-hour crosswind, with gusts up to 20, and mirage was going to make it hard to read, and he asked if she was familiar with reading wind at extended distances, and Margaret said she was, and Danny went through the safety brief, telling her to keep her rifle pointed downrange at all times, even when it was not loaded, and to wait for his signal before chambering around, and to call her shot so he could spot for her, and if at any point he said cease fire, she should immediately make her rifle safe, and Margaret confirmed she understood, and Danny studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and said the range was hot, and she could load and commence firing when ready, and Margaret settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar comfort of the rifle stock against her cheek, and she peered through her scope at the target, which was a steel plate 12 inches in diameter, positioned at 1,000 yards downrange, and it looked impossibly small through the glass, and she could hear Craig and Ben setting up in the bay next to hers with their expensive equipment, clanking against the concrete, and through the thin wall she heard Craig say something about, "This should be interesting," followed by more laughter, and Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath, then opened them and chambered around and began the process of reading The Wind and the Wind at Ridgemont Long Range. Shooting complex was notorious among precision shooters because the facility sat in a valley between two mountain ranges, creating a natural wind tunnel that caused the air to swirl and gust unpredictably, and even experienced marksmen struggled with wind calls at the longer distances, which was part of what made it such a respected venue for competitions. And Margaret watched the grass downrange through her spotting scope, noting how it bent and swayed, and she observed the mirage, that shimmering heatwave effect that experienced shooters use to read wind direction and speed. And she had learned these skills decades ago from her father, who had been obsessive about wind reading, and he used to say that wind does not care about your fancy equipment, and you can have the most expensive rifle in the world, but if you cannot read the wind, you are just wasting ammunition. And through the thin partition wall, Margaret could hear Craig and Ben discussing their own wind calls, and they were using various tools, including a handheld weather meter, a ballistic calculator app, and what sounded like a fairly sophisticated wind reading system. And Ben said, He was showing a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind from 8 o'clock gusting to 18 and recommended 2.3 mils left, and Craig confirmed it and said he was going to send one and see what happens. And Margaret heard the sharp crack of Craig's rifle, followed a moment later by the distant ping of metal, because he had hit the target, and Craig said good call and that it was right on the edge, but it was a hit, and they continued shooting, calling out their adjustments and celebrating their hits, and they were clearly skilled shooters, and their equipment was giving them a significant advantage in the difficult conditions. But Margaret continued her own preparations without rushing, and she calculated her come-ups for the 1,000-yard distance, accounting for the bullet drop of her .308 ammunition, and then she made her wind call, relying purely on what she could observe through her scope and her years of experience reading prairie winds, and she settled behind her rifle, controlled her breathing, and felt her heart rate slow, and the world narrowed down to the fundamentals, which were sight picture, breath control, and trigger squeeze. And her finger took up the slack in the trigger, applying steady rearward pressure, and the rifle fired with the recoil pushing back against her shoulder with familiar force, and she kept her eye in the scope, watching for the trace of her bullet, which was a skill that took years to develop. But she never saw the bullet impact, because at that distance, even with good optics, it was nearly impossible to track the entire flight path. And Danny called out from behind her with his voice neutral, saying it was a miss, and that he saw dust kick up about 2 feet low and a foot right. And Margaret nodded, because she was not bothered by the miss, since first-round hits at 1,000 yards in gusty winds were difficult even for professionals, and she had intentionally made a conservative wind call to see what the conditions were actually doing. Margaret made her adjustments by dialing 2 clicks of elevation into her scope and holding slightly further into the wind, and she chambered another round and settled back into position, and this time when she fired, she heard the distant ping of the bullet striking steel, and Danny called out that it was a hit, and there was a note of surprise in his voice now, and in the bay next to her, she heard Craig and Ben stop talking for a moment, and Margaret cycled the bolt, chambered another round, and fired again, and another ping echoed back across the range, and Danny confirmed it was a hit. And she fired a third time and got another hit, and then a fourth time for another hit, and a fifth time for yet another hit. And Margaret was finding her rhythm now by reading the subtle shifts in the wind and making micro-adjustments with each shot. And it was like riding a bicycle, because the skills were still there, buried under years of disuse but not forgotten. And she heard Ben say from the next bay that she was stringing them together, and Margaret continued shooting with her concentration absolute, and she reached 10 shots, then 12 shots, then 15 shots, and every single round impacted the steel target with a satisfying ring, and Danny was now standing directly behind her, watching through his spotting scope with undisguised interest, and he asked what her background was and whether she had been military or law enforcement, and Margaret replied that she was a librarian as she reloaded her magazine. And Danny repeated her words about being a librarian, with his tone making it clear he did not quite believe her, and Margaret confirmed, "It's saying books and late fees mostly." And then she fired again for another hit, and by now Craig and Ben had stopped shooting entirely and had moved to where they could watch Margaret through the open bay door, and several other shooters had noticed the consistent ringing of steel from Bay 7 and had wandered over to investigate, and Craig stood with his arms crossed, and his earlier amusement was replaced by something closer to disbelief. And he asked Danny how many in a row that was, and Danny replied 23 and clarified it was 23 for 23 at 1,000 yards and 15 mile per hour, gusting winds, and Ben asked what kind of rifle she was shooting, and Danny glanced at the rifle case lying next to Margaret's position and said it looked like a Remington 700 and .308, and a pretty basic setup from what he could see. And Craig muttered that he had to be kidding, and Margaret was aware of the growing audience, but she did not let it distract her, because she had 50 rounds loaded for this session, and she intended to shoot all 50, and she continued working through her ammunition, calling each shot to herself and making minor adjustments as the wind shifted, and she reached 25 hits, then 28 hits, then 30 hits, and the crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly a dozen people, and they were no longer trying to hide their interest as they stood in a loose semicircle around the bay entrance, watching in silence each time Margaret fired, and Danny had pulled out his phone and was recording video of her shooting, and he explained when Margaret glanced at him between shots that she would want documentation of this, because he had been a range officer there for 2 years, and he had never seen anyone shoot like this, and most of their best competitors were running about 70 to 80% hit rates in these conditions, and Margaret fired her 40th round for another hit. And the steel plate was beginning to show pockmarks from the repeated impacts with white circles where the copper-jacketed bullets had struck the painted surface. And Craig stepped closer with his skepticism clearly warring with what he was witnessing. And he asked where she had learned to shoot like that. And Margaret said simply that her father had taught her, as she chambered another round without looking, away from her scope. And Craig said her father must have been one hell of a shooter. And Margaret replied that he was adequate, which earned a few chuckles from the crowd, and she fired again for hit number 41. And as Margaret worked through her final 10 rounds, the atmosphere around Bay 7 had shifted entirely, because what had started as skepticism and condescension had transformed into genuine respect and amazement. And the other shooters were not just watching anymore, but they were studying her technique, noting how she positioned her body, how she worked the bolt, and how she seemed to read the wind through nothing more than careful observation. And she reached 45 hits, then 48 hits, then 49 hits, and Margaret chambered her 50th and final round, and the crowd had gone completely silent. And even Craig, who had initially dismissed her as someone who should step back to the beginner range, was watching with rapt attention. And Margaret settled into position one last time, controlled her breathing, and broke the shot, and the bullet flew downrange, fighting the gusty crosswind for nearly 2 full seconds before striking the steel target dead center, and she had achieved 50 hits out of 50 attempts, and the crowd erupted in applause and astonished laughter, and Danny was shaking his head in disbelief while still filming on his phone. And Craig walked up to Margaret as she began clearing her rifle, and he extended his hand, saying he owed her an apology and that he was completely out of line earlier, and that this was the most impressive display of marksmanship he had ever witnessed. And Margaret shook his hand and said the apology was accepted. Craig asked Margaret if she would be interested in competing, because there was a major match coming up in 6 weeks called the Western States Precision Rifle Championship, and the prize money was $15,000 for first place, and honestly, based on what he just saw, she would have a real shot at winning. And Margaret considered the offer as she packed up her equipment, and said finally that she would think about it. And as she walked back to her truck carrying her rifle case and range bag, she could hear the excited conversations behind her, because the other shooters were already discussing what they had witnessed, and she knew that word would spread quickly through the tight-knit precision shooting community. And Margaret Flynn, the quiet librarian from Ridgemont, had just announced herself to the world in the most dramatic way possible, and she had done it with a 50-year-old rifle and no fancy equipment, just skill, patience, and the lessons her father had taught her all those years ago on a Montana ranch. And what Margaret did not know yet was that this was only the beginning, because by Monday morning her performance at the range had become legendary, since Danny Patterson had posted his video to several shooting forums and social media groups, and it had spread like wildfire through the precision rifle community. And the title of his post was simple but effective, saying librarian shoots perfect 50 out of 50 at 1,000 yards in 15 mph, gusting winds, with a basic Remington 700, and the video had been viewed over 100,000 times in less than 48 hours, and the comment sections were filled with a mixture of amazement, skepticism, and heated debate, because some users insisted the video must be fake or edited, while others claimed that 50 rounds was not enough to prove consistency, and a few expressed outright disbelief that anyone, let alone an amateur shooter, could achieve such results. But those who had been there and who had witnessed it firsthand vouched for the authenticity of Margaret's performance, and Craig Hoffman, who had an established reputation in the community, posted his own account of the event confirming every detail, and Margaret was unaware of most of this attention because she had gone back to work at the library as usual, checking in books, helping patrons navigate the computer system, and preparing for the upcoming Halloween reading event for children. And it was not until Tuesday afternoon that she realized how far the video had spread, and she was reshelving books in the biography section when her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number, and normally she would have let it go to voicemail. But something made her answer, and a male voice with a faint Texas accent asked if this was Margaret Flynn, and when she confirmed it was, the man introduced himself as Frank Morrison and said he was the director of the Western States Precision Rifle Championship. and he was calling because he had seen a video of her shooting performance at Ridgemont, and he wanted to extend a personal invitation to compete in their championship next month. And Margaret paused while still holding a biography of Theodore Roosevelt and said she appreciated the call, but she was not really a competitive shooter, and Frank replied with all due respect that what she did on that video was exactly what competitive shooting was about, and he had been organizing precision rifle matches for 20 years, and he had never seen anything quite like that performance, and Margaret said it was just target practice, but Frank countered that it was target practice that most of their top competitors could not replicate. If you gave them 10 attempts, and he said he knew this might seem sudden, but their championship was one of the premier events in long-range precision shooting with competitors coming from 12 countries, and there was significant prize money at stake. And honestly, he thought she could win. And Margaret walked back to the circulation desk with her mind turning over the proposition, and she said she did not have any competition experience and would not even know how the format works. And Frank explained that the format was straightforward with multiple stages at various distances from 600 to 1,500 yards, and shooting from different positions under time pressure. And they provided detailed competitor guides, and if she was interested, he could connect her with some of their veterans who would be happy to help her prepare. And Margaret said she needed to think about it, and Frank said of course, but he should mention that registration closes in 1 week and they were already at capacity, and he was offering her one of their reserved sponsor slots, specifically because of what he saw in that video, and she would be shooting alongside some of the best precision rifle marksmen in the world. And after she hung up, Margaret stood behind the circulation desk, thinking because part of her was flattered by the invitation, while another part of her was deeply skeptical since she was a librarian in a small Montana town and not a professional athlete. And what business did she have competing against people who spent their entire lives perfecting this craft? And that evening, as she prepared dinner in her small kitchen, her phone rang again, and this time it was Craig Hoffman, who said he hoped she did not mind that he got her number from Katie at the range, and he wanted to follow up on his invitation from Saturday and asked if she had given any more thought to competing. Part 5. Margaret told Craig that Frank Morrison had actually called her that day and offered her a spot in the championship, and Craig said that was fantastic and asked if she was going to do it. And Margaret said she had not decided yet, and there was a pause on the other end of the line before Craig asked if he could be honest with her. And Margaret said please, and Craig explained that the precision rifle community could be quite insular with a lot of egos, a lot of expensive equipment, and a lot of people who think success in this sport is about how much money you spend on gear. And what she did on Saturday challenged that narrative, because she showed up with a basic rifle and outshot everyone there, using nothing but skill and experience, and that mattered. And Margaret said she was not trying to make any kind of statement, but Craig replied that she already had, whether she intended to or not, because that video had over 200,000 views now and people were talking about it everywhere. And he said the most common response was inspiration, because people who thought they could not compete because they did not have the money for a custom rifle were reconsidering, and people who were intimidated by the sport were feeling encouraged. And Margaret considered this because she had never thought of herself as someone who would inspire others, since she was just a woman who knew how to shoot. And Craig continued by saying there was another reason she should consider it, because there was going to be a lot of skepticism with many people who think that video was a fluke or that it was somehow faked, and the only way to answer that was to show up and prove them wrong. And honestly, based on what he saw, she could absolutely win this thing. And after she ended the call with Craig, Margaret walked out to her small backyard and looked up at the stars, and the Montana sky was clear that night, filled with more stars than most people would ever see in a lifetime. And she thought about her father, and about those early morning shooting sessions on the ranch when the world was still dark and quiet, and her father had never sought recognition for his skills, because he had taught her to shoot, because it was practical and useful and part of living on a ranch. But he had also taught her something else, something he had never put into words but that she had understood nonetheless, which was that excellence was its own reward, regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. And maybe it was time to step out of her comfortable, quiet life and see what she was truly capable of, not for the money or the recognition, but for herself, and to answer the question of whether that performance on Saturday had been a fluke or whether she really was as good as that video suggested. And Margaret pulled out her phone and called Frank. Morrison back, and when he answered, she said simply that she would like to accept his invitation and asked where she should sign up, and the next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation as Margaret took time off from the library using vacation, days she had accumulated over years of rarely taking time off, and Craig connected her with a group of experienced competitors who were generous with their advice and guidance, and she learned about the different stages, typical of precision rifle, competitions including barricade shooting, shooting from unconventional positions and timed courses of fire, and she practiced rapid target transitions and shooting while wearing a timer, and she learned the language of competitive shooting with terms like dope for ballistic data, cold bore for first-round shots, and MOA for minute of angle. And Katie Morrison, the young woman from the range who turned out to be Frank Morrison's niece, offered to help coach Margaret on the competitive aspects of the sport, and they spent hours at the range together with Katie explaining the nuances of match rules and procedures. And Katie said during one of their sessions that the biggest difference between practice and competition was the pressure, because when you are shooting in front of judges and spectators, with a clock running and prize money on the line, even the best shooters can get nervous, and Margaret replied that she did not generally get nervous, which made Katie laugh and say they would see about that. But Katie's prediction proved incorrect, because during their practice sessions, Margaret told Craig that Frank Morrison had actually called her that day and offered her a spot in the championship, and Craig said that was fantastic and asked if she was going to do it, and Margaret said she had not decided yet. And there was a pause on the other end of the line before Craig asked if he could be honest with her. And Margaret said please, and Craig explained that the precision rifle community could be quite insular with a lot of egos, a lot of expensive equipment, and a lot of people who think success in this sport is about how much money you spend on gear. And what she did on Saturday challenged that narrative, because she showed up with a basic rifle and outshot everyone there, using nothing but skill and experience, and that mattered, and Margaret said she was not trying to make any kind of statement. But Craig replied that she already had, whether she intended to or not, because that video had over 200,000 views now and people were talking about it everywhere, and he said, the most common response was inspiration, because people who thought they could not compete, because they did not have the money for a custom rifle, were reconsidering, and people who were intimidated by the sport were feeling encouraged, and Margaret considered this because she had never thought of herself as someone who would inspire others, since she was just a woman who knew how to shoot. And Craig continued by saying, there was another reason she should consider it, because there was going to be a lot of skepticism with many people who think that video was a fluke or that it was somehow faked, and the only way to answer that was to show up and prove them wrong. And honestly, based on what he saw, she could absolutely win this thing. And after she ended the call with Craig, Margaret walked out to her small backyard and looked up at the stars, and the Montana sky was clear that night, filled with more stars than most people would ever see in a lifetime. And she thought about her father, and about those early morning shooting sessions on the ranch when the world was still dark and quiet, and her father had never sought recognition for his skills, because he had taught her to shoot, because it was practical and useful and part of living on a ranch. But he had also taught her something else, something he had never put into words but that she had understood nonetheless, which was that excellence was its own reward regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. And maybe it was time to step out of her comfortable, quiet life and see what she was truly capable of, not for the money or the recognition, but for herself, and to answer the question of whether that performance on Saturday had been a fluke, or whether she really was as good as that video suggested. And Margaret pulled out her phone and called Frank Morrison back, and when he answered, she said simply that she would like to accept his invitation, and asked where she should sign up. And the next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation, as Margaret took time off from the library using vacation, days she had accumulated over years of rarely taking time off. And Craig connected her with a group of experienced competitors who were generous with their advice and guidance, and she learned about the different stages typical of precision rifle, competitions including barricade shooting, shooting from unconventional positions and timed courses of fire, and she practiced rapid target transitions and shooting while wearing a timer, and she learned the language of competitive shooting with terms like dope for ballistic data, cold bore for first-round shots, and MOA for minute of angle. And Katie Morrison, the young woman from the range who turned out to be Frank Morrison's niece, offered to help coach Margaret on the competitive aspects of the sport, and they spent hours at the range together with Katie explaining the nuances of match rules and procedures, And Katie said during one of their sessions that the biggest difference between practice and competition was the pressure. Because when you are shooting in front of judges and spectators, with a clock running and prize money on the line, even the best shooters can get nervous, and Margaret replied that she did not generally get nervous, which made Katie laugh and say they would see about that. But Katie's prediction proved incorrect, because during their practice sessions, Margaret remained as calm and methodical as she had been during her first visit to the range, and she approached each stage analytically by breaking down the challenge into manageable components. And she was not the fastest shooter, but she was consistently accurate and in precision. Rifle competition, accuracy was paramount, and as the championship approached, Margaret found herself becoming known in shooting circles because more videos had emerged from the range showing her practice sessions, and shooting magazines and websites published articles about the mysterious librarian who had appeared from nowhere to challenge the established competitors, and some of the attention was positive while others were more skeptical or dismissive. And one prominent shooting blogger wrote an article titled, "One Good Day Does Not Make a Champion," and argued that Margaret's viral video was an outlier and that she would crumble under the pressure of real competition. But Margaret did not read most of the articles because she was too busy preparing, although she was aware of the expectations, the skepticism, and the weight of representation she was carrying, and whether she had wanted it or not. She had become a symbol of something larger than herself. The night before she was scheduled to drive to the championship venue in Wyoming, Margaret sat at her kitchen table cleaning her rifle, and it was the same ritual she had performed hundreds of times. But tonight it felt different, because this rifle, her father's rifle, was about to be tested on the biggest stage of her shooting career. And she thought about calling her brothers and telling them what she was about to do, but decided against it because they had drifted apart over the years, with each focused on their own lives and families, and they knew she shot occasionally, but they had no idea of her skill level. And if she won, she could share the news, but if she lost, there was no need to mention it at all. And Margaret reassembled the rifle while running her hand along the worn stock, and she said quietly, "To let us go see what we can do," then turned off the lights and went to bed. And she slept soundly while dreaming of wind and distance and the satisfying ring of bullets striking. Steel in the Western States Precision Rifle Championship was held at a sprawling facility outside Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the property covered over 2,000 acres of rolling prairie with shooting positions established at various elevations to create challenging angles and long sight lines. And the main venue included a large covered shooting structure, competitor tents, vendor booths, and a spectator area complete with large screens showing live feeds from the different stages. And Margaret arrived early Friday morning, 2 days before the competition began, because she wanted time to familiarize herself with the venue and register without the pressure of last-minute rushing. And as she drove through the main gate, she was struck by the scale of the event because there were hundreds of vehicles in the parking area, most of them expensive trucks and SUVs loaded with gear. And she saw license plates from California, Texas, Montana, and even a few from Canada. And the registration area was buzzing with activity as competitors in tactical clothing stood in clusters, comparing equipment and discussing strategy, and many wore jerseys covered with sponsor logos. And the rifles on display were works of art, custom-built precision instruments that probably cost more than Margaret's truck, and she felt suddenly out of place in her simple jeans and flannel shirt while carrying her father's old rifle case. But she squared her shoulders and walked to the registration desk, where a cheerful volunteer wearing a championship shirt smiled as Margaret approached and asked for her name. And Margaret said, "Margaret Flynn," and the volunteer's fingers flew across her keyboard, then stopped, and she looked up, with her eyes widening slightly, and asked if she was the Margaret Flynn from the Ridgemont video. And Margaret confirmed that would be her, and the volunteer said, "Oh my gosh," and that it was such an honor because everyone had been talking about her, and she grabbed a radio to call Frank Morrison, saying he would want to meet Margaret personally. And within minutes, Frank Morrison appeared as a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and an infectious smile, and he extended his hand warmly, while welcoming Margaret to the championship and asking how her drive was, and Margaret replied it was uneventful, and complimented his nice facility. And Frank thanked her and said they had been building it up for years, and he guided her through the registration process while explaining the weekend schedule. And he said tonight was the competitor briefing at 6 in the evening, and tomorrow was a practice day where she could familiarize herself with the stages, and competition would start. Sunday morning at 8 sharp, and he handed her a packet of information including a detailed stage briefing, a map of the facility, and her competitor number, which was 117. And Frank said one more thing while lowering his voice slightly because there had been a lot of buzz about her showing up and some people were excited while some were skeptical, and she should just be prepared for attention. And Margaret nodded and said she was just here to shoot. And Frank replied, that was the right attitude, and wished her good luck. And as she walked back to her truck to gather her gear, Margaret noticed people watching her because some pointed discreetly, while others pulled out their phones presumably to text friends that the librarian had arrived, and she ignored them all and focused on getting settled into the competitor area and the competitor briefing. That evening was held in a large tent with seating for over 300 people, and Margaret found a seat toward the back, hoping to observe without drawing attention. But that hope was dashed when Frank Morrison took the stage and began his opening remarks by saying that before they dove into the stage briefings, he wanted to acknowledge some of their notable competitors. And he mentioned they had multiple national champions there, along with several military and law enforcement snipers and representatives from 12 different countries. And he paused with a slight smile playing at his lips and said, they also had someone who needed no introduction because he suspected most of them had seen the video, and Margaret Flynn was joining them from Montana. And he had to say he was very interested to see how she performed this weekend, and hundreds of heads turned to look at Margaret, and she felt her face flush but kept her expression neutral, and a smattering of applause rippled through the tent. Though she noticed some competitors who conspicuously did not join in. After the briefing concluded, Margaret was approached by several competitors who wanted to introduce themselves, and some were genuinely friendly and welcoming, while others had a competitive edge to their politeness as they sized her up like fighters before a match. And one competitor in particular stood out because his name was Kevin Graham, and he was a 3-time champion of the Western States event and one of the top-ranked precision rifle shooters in the country, and he was in his early 40s, fit and confident, with the bearing of someone accustomed to winning, and his rifle was a custom-built masterpiece that probably cost $20,000. And Kevin approached her with a calculating smile and said her name while mentioning he had watched her video about 30 times and called it impressive shooting, very impressive. And Margaret thanked him. And Kevin said he was curious though, because that was a single session at a single distance with no time pressure. But competition was different with multiple stages, different positions, a clock running, and judges watching, and it was a completely different animal. And Margaret said evenly that she understood that. And Kevin asked if she really did, because he had seen a lot of good range shooters crumble in competition since the pressure gets to them and they start second-guessing themselves and their technique falls apart. And he leaned in slightly with his voice dropping and said he was not trying to intimidate her but was just saying she should not feel bad if this weekend did not go the way she was hoping, because there was no shame in being outclassed by professionals. And Margaret held his gaze and said, thank you for the advice, and that she would keep it in mind. And Kevin's smile widened as he said, good luck out there, because she was going to need it. And after he walked away, the competitor standing next to Margaret, who was a woman in her 30s named Lisa Chen, muttered not to let Kevin get in her head because he pulled that psychological warfare nonsense with everyone. And the best response was to just beat him on the range and let her shooting do the talking. And Margaret replied that was the plan, and Saturday's practice day was invaluable, as Margaret worked through each stage methodically while learning the target arrays and timing her sequences, and the stages were indeed more complex than anything she had practiced, because one stage required shooting from a steep hillside at targets ranging from 800 to 1,200 yards, while another involved shooting from a barricade with multiple ports and transitioning rapidly between targets at different distances, and the most challenging stage was called Mountain Sniper, which required competitors to hike a quarter-mile uphill carrying all their equipment, then engage targets at extreme distances while managing their elevated heart rate and breathing. And it was designed to simulate real-world mountainous hunting or military scenarios. And Margaret approached each stage analytically by breaking down the challenges and developing strategies, and she was not the fastest shooter on the practice range, but she was thorough and deliberate, and by the end of the day she felt reasonably prepared for what was coming. And that evening, back at her modest hotel room, Margaret laid out her equipment and reviewed her notes because she had mapped out each stage, calculated her ballistic data for the different distances, and prepared her game plan, and she felt a strange calm settling over her, which was the same feeling she got when she was about to shoot on the ranch, because all the noise and distraction fell away, leaving only the fundamentals. And Sunday morning arrived clear and cool, which was perfect shooting weather, and Margaret arrived at the venue early and checked in with the match officials, and competitors were divided into squads that would rotate through the stages throughout the day, and Margaret was assigned to Squad 8, which meant she would start on Stage 4, which was the barricade stage. And as she made her way to the starting position, she noticed the substantial crowd that had gathered because spectators lined the shooting areas, and the large screens were already displaying live feeds, and she saw news crews with cameras, photographers with long lenses, and what appeared to be several online streamers setting up their equipment, and the attention should have been overwhelming. But Margaret found that once she stepped up to the shooting line, everything else disappeared, because it was just her. The rifle and the targets, and the range officer for her stage was a serious young man named Greg, who walked her through the stage brief one more time by pointing out the 5 targets at various distances and explaining the time limit, and he said she would have 10 minutes to engage all 5 targets with 2 rounds per target, and she could shoot from any of the barricade positions. And he asked if she had any questions, and Margaret said no questions, and Greg asked if the shooter was ready, and Margaret said ready, and he said stand by. Then raised his timer and said beep, and Margaret moved into position while settling her rifle on the barricade, and the first target was at 600 yards, and she found it in her scope, confirmed her dope, controlled her breathing, and broke the shot, and through her scope she saw the puff of dust behind the target indicating a hit, and she cycled the bolt and fired again for another hit, and she transitioned to the second target at 750 yards and fired 2 shots for 2 hits, and then the third target at 900 yards produced hit after hit, and the rhythm was there, which was the same rhythm she had found at Ridgemont, and despite the pressure, despite the watching crowds and running clock, Margaret felt completely at ease because this was what she knew how to do. Margaret engaged the 4th target at 1,000 yards and scored hit after hit, and then moved to the 5th target at 1,100 yards in a gusty crosswind, and she took an extra moment to read the conditions, made her wind call, and fired for a hit. And her second shot also connected, and Greg called out time at 7 minutes and 42 seconds, and announced 10 for 10, which was a perfect stage. And Margaret cleared her rifle and stepped back from the barricade, only then becoming aware of the cheering from the spectators, and on the large screen visible from her position, she could see a replay of her stage run with the words Flynn 10 out of 10 displayed prominently, and that was just the beginning of her day, because by lunchtime Margaret had completed 4 stages, and word of her performance was spreading through the venue like wildfire, since she had shot perfect scores on all 4 stages, which was a feat that even the most experienced competitors found remarkable. And on the large screens scattered throughout the facility, her name had climbed to the top of the leaderboard, tied with Kevin Graham and 2 other top-ranked shooters, and the mountain sniper stage had been particularly impressive because Margaret had hiked the quarter-mile uphill without apparent difficulty, since her years of Montana hiking were paying dividends, and while some younger competitors arrived at the shooting position gasping for air, Margaret had controlled her breathing quickly and engaged all 6 targets with mechanical precision, scoring 12 shots and 12 hits all, while her heart rate was elevated from the climb. And after the first day of competition, concluded Margaret, was tied for first place with Kevin Graham because both had dropped only 2 points across all 8 stages, and Kevin had missed 1 target completely and scored 1 borderline hit that the judges had ruled as a near miss, costing him 2 points, while Margaret had scored 1 near miss on stage 6, which was a difficult shot at 1,300 yards in variable winds, and the rest of the field was significantly behind them because the third-place competitor was down 15 points, and the gap only widened from there. And Monday morning arrived with less favorable weather as a storm front had moved in overnight, bringing with it gusty winds and intermittent rain showers, and the match officials had briefly considered postponing the second day, but ultimately decided to proceed, much to the dismay of many competitors who knew that difficult conditions would magnify any weaknesses in their skills. But Margaret was unbothered by the weather because she had grown up shooting in Montana, where perfect conditions were rare, And wind was a constant companion, and if anything, the challenging weather might work to her advantage. And as the day progressed, the gap between Margaret and the rest of the field began to widen because Kevin Graham was having a rougher day and was clearly frustrated by the challenging conditions, and he was still shooting well by any objective measure, but his perfectionistic standards meant that anything less than flawless was unacceptable to him. And on one particularly difficult stage, Kevin missed 3 targets completely and scored only borderline hits on 2 others, which was a catastrophic performance that dropped him to 4th place in the standings, while Margaret shot the same stage with her usual calm precision and scored 10 hits out of 12 shots. And by the time the lunch break arrived, she had opened up a 23-point lead over the 2nd-place competitor, who was a Canadian shooter named Peter Hughes, and during lunch, Margaret noticed Kevin standing alone near his truck staring at his rifle, with an expression of barely contained frustration, and she considered leaving him to his thoughts, but decided that was not right, because regardless of his earlier condescension, he was a fellow competitor dealing with a difficult day, and she walked over slowly and asked if he was having a rough morning, and Kevin looked up surprised to see her, and for a moment his competitive mask slipped and she saw genuine frustration and something else underneath which might have been respect. And he said yeah, and that the weather was destroying him, because he could not get his wind calls right, and his ballistic solver kept giving him data that did not match what was happening downrange, and Margaret said gently that computers were useful tools but they could not feel the wind, and sometimes you had to trust what you see and feel more than what the technology tells you. And they talked for a few more minutes about wind reading and shooting technique as Margaret shared some of the lessons her father had taught her about using multiple indicators to read wind, and about trusting your instincts when the data seems wrong and when they parted. Kevin extended his hand and said good luck this afternoon and added that he hoped she won because she deserved it. And by the time the final stage arrived, Margaret had opened up a commanding lead, and barring a complete collapse, she had secured the championship. But she refused to let her focus slip because she had come here to prove something, not just to win but to show that she belonged among these elite competitors. And when the final shot rang out and the last target pinged with the unmistakable sound of a hit, Margaret set her rifle down and took a deep breath because it was over, and she had achieved 12 for 12 on the final stage, which was a nearly perfect performance across 2 days of competition in increasingly difficult conditions. And the crowd erupted in applause as the final scores were calculated and posted, and Margaret Flynn had won the Western States Precision Rifle Championship by 41 points, which was the largest margin of victory in the event's history, and she had missed only 7 shots across the entire competition, which was a stunning display of consistency that would be talked about for years to come.